The key was broken, snapped in two, lying silent on the doormat like it had crawled out of my shame. I bent slowly, picked it up. It was the spare I'd given him years ago, back when he said, "You're always welcome." He didn't have to say anything now. This little metal half-truth was louder than words. I held it in my palm, felt its cold weight settle deep in my chest. It was his way of saying, "Don't come back." Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. The room I rent now is small, just a bed, a chair, and a little window that watches over the alley behind the bakery. It smells like sugar and burnt coffee most mornings. The walls are thin, but I've come to appreciate the muffled sounds of life. Pans clinking, someone laughing downstairs, the whir of the dough mixer that starts before dawn. It reminds me I'm still here. Still part of something, even if no one quite sees me. I'm 68. A widow for nearly 9 years now. My husband, Harold, passed quietly one evening in his favorite chair. Bible on his lap, reading glasses slipping down his nose. It was lung cancer that took him, though he never smoked a day in his life. After that, it was just me and my son, Matthew. Matthew was a quiet boy, polite, curious, always asking questions about how things worked. He used to sit at the kitchen table while I packed his lunch, swinging his legs and telling me about his dreams. He wanted to build houses, he said, so no one would ever have to feel cold. I held that sentence in my heart like a hymn. We didn't have much, but we made do. I worked at the local library, a small brick building with creaky floors and sun-warmed windows. For 31 years I worked there, mostly in the children's section, helping young readers find their first books. The smell of paper and ink felt like home to me. My name's still on the wall near the front desk. Plaque's a little dusty now. When Matthew got married, I gave him our family savings, what little we had, to help with the down payment on his first home. I didn't even hesitate. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We empty our pockets so our children can fill theirs. And when his wife left, walked out with only a note and a half-packed suitcase, it was me he called in tears. I moved in without question, cared for the grandkids, cooked their meals, helped with their homework, picked up his laundry when he forgot. I had my own little corner in the basement, my quilt, my books, a rocking chair Harold had made for me when I turned 40. I didn't mind. I told myself it was temporary, just until things settled. But months turned to years. The house echoed differently over time. My place shrunk slowly. First it was fewer family dinners, then skipped birthdays, then the silence of mornings where no one said hello. I noticed little things. How Matthew stopped making eye contact. How the grandkids began calling me her, instead of grandma. How my son's voice had a new sharpness, tired, like I was one more chore on his endless list. Still, I stayed. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I believed love would turn things around. That if I just gave a little more, maybe he'd see me again. I started working part-time again at the library, just a few hours a week, shelving returns, reading to the little ones. My hands weren't as quick anymore, and my knees complained when I bent down too often, but it gave me something to hold on to. Then came the day I misplaced a book order form. I felt the shift in my mind, like a drawer that wouldn't quite close. I laughed it off, made a note to follow up, but deep down I knew. Something inside was beginning to slow. The doctor called it age-related cognitive fatigue. Not Alzheimer's. Not yet, but enough to be noticeable. I told Matthew over tea one Sunday morning. He barely looked up from his phone. Said, "Well, we'll figure something out." That was all. 2 days later, I found brochures on my bed, places with names like Sun Haven and Golden Oaks. Bright, cheerful buildings with wide hallways and pastel walls. Places where the old go to disappear. He didn't ask. He just assumed. And somehow that hurt more than if he'd yelled. But I held on. I smiled through it, made sure the children had lunch, folded his shirts just the way he liked. Then came the job loss. The library let me go, budget cuts, they said. The new director didn't see the value in legacy staff. I cried in the back office that day alone, hand on the shelf where I'd once hung my coat. I walked home slower than usual, the air thick in my lungs. When I told Matthew, he sighed, rubbed his face like I'd given him bad news about the stock market. And then he said it. I can't carry dead weight. Just like that. No anger in his voice. Just finality. He gave me 10 days. 10 days to pack my life into 2 suitcases and leave the home I had once paid for. No talk of where I'd go, no offer of help. Just a printed list of nearby boarding houses, folded on the counter like a menu. I didn't cry in front of him. I went down to my basement corner, sat in my rocking chair, and held the frayed edge of Harold's quilt in my hands. I remembered how he used to say, "Storms don't last, Ellie, but they do show you what's worth saving." I stared at that broken key for a long time the day I left. It wasn't just metal. It was memory. It was love worn thin and then snapped clean through. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out quietly, 2 bags, 1 coat, and a heart full of silence. And that's where the story truly began. The boarding house was old, paint chipped, stairs that creaked loud enough to wake the dead, and a smell of dust that never quite left your clothes. But the room was mine. It locked from the inside, had a window that opened to the street, and a little shelf where I placed my husband's photo. Still, I missed the noise of my grandchildren. The way little Ellie used to curl up on my lap and ask for bedtime stories. How Henry would run to me when he scraped his knee, knowing I'd always have a bandage and a peppermint ready. But weeks passed and not a single visit. Not a call. Not even a note. I told myself they were busy. Children forget. Parents forget to remind them. That's what I said when other tenants asked if I had family nearby. Every morning I walked to the little market to buy day-old bread and coffee. My pension wasn't much, and I'd never needed to budget so tightly before. I learned to stretch every dollar, to make soup from scraps, to mend old clothes with thread that barely matched. I sent Matthew a birthday card. Simple, polite. Signed it, "Love, Mom." No reply. No thank you. Just silence. It echoed louder than words ever could. Then I heard from Mrs. Carmichael, the landlady's cousin, who liked to gossip during laundry. "You know," she said, folding towels, "that building on Weller Street, yours used to live there, didn't he? Got behind on his rent, I heard. Landlord's desperate to sell. Poor maintenance, noisy tenants, that sort of thing." I didn't say anything, just nodded. But something tugged at me. Weller Street. That was where Matthew had moved after I left. Said it was temporary, just until he got his finances in order. The same building I had once dropped groceries off at when he couldn't afford to shop. A week later, I walked there, took the bus, and then shuffled the 3 blocks on aching feet. I stood across the street for a long time, staring at the faded brick walls, the metal fire escape that clung to the side like a spiderweb. And then I saw him, Matthew, my son, stepping out the front door with a bag of takeout and his jacket slung over his shoulder. He didn't see me, but I saw him laugh. Heard him joke with the driver of a waiting car. He looked well, healthy, comfortable, not like a man crushed by stress, not like a man who couldn't afford to house his own mother. I turned away before he noticed me. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with something colder. A quiet shift, like a curtain drawing back. Back at the boarding house, I pulled out an old envelope from my handbag. Inside were my Social Security statements, my library severance, and the last bit of savings Harold and I had tucked away. Meant for something special, he used to say. I stared at those numbers, shaky but steady. And then I remembered the for sale sign I'd passed by earlier that week, in front of a building only 3 blocks from where I now lived. It was leaning awkwardly, half buried in overgrown grass. The paint on the letters had faded. I walked back there the next morning, pressed my hand against the front gate. It needed work. A lot of it, but the bones were strong. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something flutter quietly in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but a direction. I didn't call Matthew after that. I didn't send another card. I stopped wondering what I did wrong or when he stopped seeing me as his mother. Instead, I started making lists. What repairs were needed? Who owned the building? What it might cost? Whether it could be mine. I'd spent so many years making things comfortable for others, tucking corners, wiping counters, smoothing over tension with soft words. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make something for myself. I still cried sometimes. In the dark, when no one could hear. Grief is like that. It slips into your quiet places and sits beside you without asking. But I no longer cried from confusion. The lines were clear now. Matthew had pushed me out not from need, but from choice. A quiet decision made long before I ever lost that job. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It wasn't that he didn't have room for me. It was that he no longer wanted to make room. And that, I realized, had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with who he had become. I went to sleep that night holding my husband's old quilt and whispering into the folds. I may be small, Harold, but I am not done yet. The library called me just once more, about a month after they let me go. Not to ask me back. No, that door had closed. They'd found a volunteer to run story time, a college student with bright hair and a louder voice. They just wanted to know if I'd forgotten to return my staff key. I mailed it the next day, wrapped in a piece of notebook paper with the words, "Thank you for everything," written in my slow, careful handwriting. I held the envelope for a long time before dropping it into the mailbox. My hands trembled, not from the weight of the key, but from what it meant. Another door I would never walk through again. I had loved that place. Loved the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the dust motes dancing in morning sunbeams, the children's laughter echoing off the high ceilings. I had built something there, made it warm, welcoming. I used to believe I belonged somewhere. But belonging, I was starting to learn, was not permanent. Neither was being needed. When I returned to the boarding house that day, there was a message slipped under my door. My landlady, Mrs. Albright, said the new owner was inspecting the property soon and some tenants might be asked to leave. I sat down on my narrow bed, the paper still in my lap. My name wasn't mentioned. No eviction date, no demands. Just the warning, written in careful script. The new owner. I wondered what kind of person he or she might be. Someone who bought buildings and changed lives with a signature. A strange thought came over me then. A feeling that this world kept moving further and further away from people like me. Quiet people. Older women with soft voices and worn hands. We weren't useful anymore. We were burdens. Dead weight. That phrase again. Dead weight. It clung to me like a second skin. I thought about Matthew's face when he said it. Calm. Cold. Like he was reading from a script someone else had handed him. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. That was the thing about the worst betrayals. They don't come with shouts or fists. They arrive quietly, tucked inside familiar faces, spoken in soft tones that leave no scars on the skin. Only the soul. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, wrapped in Harold's quilt, listening to the wind rattle the gutter outside. I thought about all the rooms I had cleaned, all the birthday cakes I had baked, the nights I had sat up with sick children while Matthew slept soundly in his bed. I thought about how quickly I had been reduced to a problem, an inconvenience. Not because I changed, but because their kindness had run out. And somewhere between midnight and morning, I felt the final thread snap. Not with rage. Not with noise. Just a breath, a slow exhale, like letting go of a balloon you've held too tightly for too long. I looked around the room, my small shelf, my single lamp, the chipped mug I always used for tea. And I whispered, to no one in particular. They don't get to decide who I am. Not anymore. I rose slowly, made a cup of tea, and opened the little drawer beside my bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a folded paper I had kept from my husband's things. A handwritten note, just one line. Keep something for yourself, Ellie. He had written it during our first winter together, when we were still figuring out marriage. I had forgotten it was there. Or maybe I had been too afraid to look. But now it felt like an instruction. A map. I had given too much. Every last drop. And the people I gave it to, they forgot. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was simply done. Done explaining myself. Done hoping they'd remember who I used to be. Done waiting for them to see me again. So I started making plans, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because if the world had no place for me, I would make one. If I was invisible, I would become the kind of invisible that watches, and waits, and builds. Quietly. Carefully. With purpose. The kind that doesn't beg for space, but claims it. Not loud. Never loud. But strong. There's a stillness that comes after you stop hoping someone will come back for you. Not sadness, just clarity. A quiet, weightless sort of freedom. I remember waking up that morning with no plans, and no one expecting anything from me. I made my tea, added one sugar cube like Harold used to do for me, and sat by the window. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the streetlight outside was blinking, as if unsure whether to give up or keep trying. I understood that feeling. I still walked most days, even if I didn't need to go anywhere. My legs ached less when I moved, and my heart didn't feel so heavy under the sky. It was on one of those walks, 2 days after I sat with Harold's note in the dark, that I passed the building again. The one with the faded "for sale" sign leaning sideways like a tired man against a lamppost. It was on the corner of Martin and Pine. For stories high, brick faded to a soft rust. A metal gate sagged open, and the windows stared back at me like eyes too tired to pretend anymore. But there was something honest about it. I stood there longer than I meant to, watched how the sunlight hit its edges, how the vines clung to the side like someone still holding on. I saw potential, not money, not glory. Just a place to belong. A place no one could throw me out of again. That evening, I walked to the small public library near the park and asked the young man at the desk how to look up city property records. He smiled kindly, showed me how to search online. It was owned by a bank now, foreclosure, unpaid taxes, repairs too costly for quick resale. I copied down the number. The next morning I called. My voice trembled at first. I wasn't used to making bold requests. But the woman on the phone spoke plainly. Yes, it was available. No, it hadn't passed inspection. Yes, they'd entertain a cash offer if the buyer understood the risks. Cash offer. The phrase clung to me like a dare. I didn't have much. But I had some. My pension. My Social Security. Harold's old savings bond, and the money I'd hidden in a sugar tin long ago, back when we still used envelopes marked rainy day. It wouldn't cover everything. Not even close. But maybe just enough. Just enough to start. The next week was a blur of quiet courage. I visited the bank, signed papers with trembling hands, sat across from a real estate agent who looked at me like I might not survive the winter. But I did it. I bought the building. The deed was printed on cheap paper, but I held it like it was gold. My name, Eleanor Jean Whitaker, stamped clearly at the bottom. For the first time in years, I owned something again. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I chose it. The agent asked if I had family to help with renovations. I smiled and said, "No, it's just me." I didn't offer more. And he didn't ask. When I walked into the building that first time as its owner, I stood in the middle of the lobby, a chipped floor, peeling paint, the smell of mildew clinging to the air. And I cried. Not from fear. From relief. Because I had stopped waiting to be rescued. I was rescuing myself. I visited each floor, making notes in a little notebook I carried now. Unit 1A, broken light fixtures. Unit 2C, cracked window pane. The elevator didn't work, but I took the stairs one slow step at a time, pausing at every landing to catch my breath and smile to myself. Some of the tenants had already moved out. A few were still holding on, quiet folks, mostly older, some young families trying to make ends meet. I told them nothing would change right away, that I wasn't there to throw anyone out. I just wanted to bring the place back to life. They nodded, wary but polite. I didn't mention my son. Not yet. Not until I reached the mailbox labeled M. Whitaker, 3B. I stared at it for a long time. He was living here. In my building. He had no idea. It wasn't anger I felt in that moment. Just stillness. Like standing at the edge of a lake and watching your reflection move. I slid my fingers along the edge of the mailbox and whispered, "We'll come back to this." And I did. But not with rage. Not with vengeance. With order. With clarity. Over the next week, I sent letters to the tenants. Notices about upcoming improvements, planned repairs, rent reevaluations based on market standards. 3B received the same letter as everyone else. Typed. Respectful. Signed with my full name. I didn't raise the rent out of spite. I raised it to match the truth. And I watched as the pieces began to shift. Slowly. Silently. Not as revenge. As reclamation. The first thing I fixed was the door. It didn't lock right. Swung open with a gust of wind. For a building meant to house people with no place else to go, that felt too much like an invitation to the cold. I called a locksmith, paid in cash, and stood behind him as he worked. He kept glancing at me, curious, like he couldn't quite place what I was doing there. "Are you the manager?" he asked, tightening a hinge. "No," I said gently, watching his hands work the brass. "I'm the owner." He nodded, slow, respectful, but I could tell he hadn't expected that answer. People don't often expect much from women like me. Wrinkled hands, slow gait, soft voice. They think we belong in rocking chairs, not behind property deeds. But I kept going. I spent my days in quiet motion, patching holes, painting trim, replacing old curtains with ones I found at thrift stores. I swept the lobby each morning, polished the handrails, planted 2 flower pots on the steps. Daisies and geraniums. Nothing fancy. Just something alive to greet whoever walked in. And I began keeping a little logbook, Harold-style, dates, repairs, costs. I liked the routine. I liked the feeling of purpose stitched into each line. Most tenants started to nod hello. Some brought me coffee, left baked goods outside my door. An older woman on the second floor, Mrs. Ibarra, began helping me water the plants. We didn't talk much, but when she smiled, it felt like trust. Still, I hadn't spoken to Matthew. I didn't need to. I watched his rent check come in late, always short. Just as I'd expected. He'd always had a way of promising tomorrow what he couldn't deliver today. But I didn't say a word. Instead, I drafted a letter, formal, quiet, even-toned. I included documentation of the needed repairs, new property taxes, adjusted rental agreements. Rent would increase in 30 days as per standard notice. Everyone received the same letter, including him. But I signed mine at the bottom with careful care. Sincerely, Eleanor J. Whitaker, owner. No, Mom. No family sentiment. Just fact. I dropped the letters in the mail slots myself. My hand paused briefly over his, Unit 3B, before sliding the envelope through. He would know now. Not just that rent was going up, but that it was me. I imagined his face when he read it. Surprise, maybe anger. Possibly confusion. But I didn't let myself dwell on it too long. I had other work to do. The roof leaked near the stairwell, so I climbed up with a contractor to assess it. My legs ached with each step, but I didn't complain. I learned to read estimates, negotiate bids, ask questions twice to be sure. I called the city, arranged for a code inspection. Filed permits under my name. Sat through meetings where men talked around me, until they realized I was the one writing checks. Every time I signed a form, I thought of the broken key, the one Matthew had left on the mat, snapped and silent. He thought he'd locked me out, but he hadn't seen the doors I still had left. There was a dignity in the work. Not the kind others give you, but the kind you earn with each small step. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was simply building something I could live with. And slowly, I began to feel taller in my skin. One morning, I saw him in the lobby, Matthew. He hadn't seen me yet. He was on his phone, pacing, muttering something about increased costs and not fair. His jaw was tight, his back turned. I didn't speak. Just walked past slowly, quietly, letting my footsteps echo gently behind him. He turned. Our eyes met. He looked startled. For a moment, his lips parted like he might say my name. But I just nodded once and kept walking, calm and even. I didn't owe him a scene. I owed myself peace. Later that evening, I found the rent notice envelope crumpled in the trash bin by the lobby mailboxes. But it didn't matter. The notice had been served. The reckoning had begun, not with fists or fury, but with structure, with boundaries, with my name etched into the bones of the building he called home. For years, I had bent to make others comfortable. Now, I stood still and let the world adjust around me. It wasn't the first time I'd been pushed out of something I built. Not the first time someone I loved looked at me not as a person, but as a placeholder, something useful until it wasn't. Sometimes, when I sat in the quiet office I'd made on the first floor, an old coat closet I cleaned out and filled with folders, ledgers, and a small radio, I'd find myself staring out the little window and drifting backward. Not to the boarding house. Not to the broken key. But to a time years before, after Harold passed. The funeral had been modest, just close friends, neighbors, and church folks. Matthew had stood beside me, hand firm on my shoulder, his face stiff with sorrow. He'd cried at the burial. I remember that clearly. His tears had fallen silently, like he didn't want anyone to see, and I'd thought then, he's still my boy. But grief has a strange way of shifting people. 2 weeks after the service, I came home from the grocery store to find boxes in the hallway. My photo albums, Harold's old flannel shirts, the Afghan I kept on the back of the couch. Matthew stood in the living room with his wife, Lisa, arms crossed. We were just making things easier, she said quickly, before I even stepped through the door. Matthew avoided my eyes. It's time you had your own space, Mom. I stared at the boxes. My chest was tight, too tight to breathe. What do you mean? He gestured toward the stairs. We cleaned the basement. Set it up for you. It's private. Quiet. I walked down the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing. The room smelled like cement and laundry detergent. A single cot was pushed against the wall. One dresser. A chair. The space where the washer and dryer hummed to themselves. It wasn't a room. It was a corner. That night, I unpacked in silence. No one came down. No one helped. I laid Harold's shirts in the dresser drawers like folded memories, placing the softest ones on top. I told myself it was temporary, just until they sorted things out. But weeks passed. Then months. I stopped setting a place for myself at dinner. Lisa never said it outright, but I could feel her edge. The way she tensed when I entered a room, the way the children's laughter quieted when I spoke. Eventually, I learned to eat early, alone, and to make myself useful at odd hours. I ironed shirts after midnight, cleaned floors when the house was empty, became a ghost that scrubbed and folded and disappeared. The hardest part wasn't the room. It was the silence. The way Matthew never said thank you. Never asked how I was sleeping. Never offered anything more than, "Hey, can you grab the kids tomorrow?" He stopped being my son in those small, unspoken ways. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like sand eroding a shoreline. I remember one evening when Henry, the youngest, crawled onto my lap in the basement and asked why I didn't live upstairs. I didn't know how to answer, so I kissed his forehead and told him, sometimes grown-ups just need their own quiet. But it wasn't quiet. It was exile. After Lisa left him, he barely said a word about it. Just came downstairs one day and dropped her wedding ring into my hand. "Keep this," he muttered. "I don't want it around." I didn't ask questions. I just tucked it into my jewelry box and held him as he cried into my shoulder, like a little boy again. That was the last time he held me. After that, he began building walls I couldn't climb. He sold the house 2 years later. Didn't tell me until after the papers were signed. "Fresh start," he said, handing me a brochure for a senior apartment complex an hour outside town. I stared at the glossy picture of smiling strangers and pastel walls and felt my throat close. He gave me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to pack up a lifetime of being a mother. I didn't argue. I just folded Harold's shirts again, this time into a suitcase, and left the home I once bought for him. The same boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him stories. The same boy who brought me wildflowers tied in rubber bands. The same boy who once whispered, "I love you more than the sky." He became the man who handed me a deadline. I suppose that wound never really closed. Not fully. But here, now, I finally stopped pressing against it. I finally let it scar. Because what he gave me in cruelty, he also gave me in clarity. He showed me where I didn't belong. And that was the first step to building where I did. Now, as I watched tenants come and go, as I filed reports and signed contracts, I understood. I had let too many people tell me where to stand. But not anymore. I had chosen this place. Brick by brick, form by form, I was rewriting what home meant. And this time, no one else would hold the pen. I had just come back from the hardware store when I found the envelope in the building's outgoing mail slot. Left open, half hanging, as if someone had changed their mind at the last minute. I never snooped. Not really. But something about the way it dangled caught my eye. My name was on it, neatly typed. To whom it may concern, property owner, for 17 Weller Street. I slid it out carefully, hand steady, though my chest began to thrum. Inside was a letter from Matthew. He was disputing the rent increase. He'd written a page and a half, explaining how the apartment wasn't worth the new rate, citing broken blinds, outdated appliances, and no clear ownership communication. He said the landlord had failed to notify him properly, that the rent adjustment was unfair and potentially unlawful. But what struck me deepest wasn't the wording. It was the closing line. I doubt the new owner even knows what they're doing. I sat down on the lobby bench, the one I'd reupholstered just last month, and held the paper in both hands like it might burst into flames. He didn't know. He had no idea. After all this time, after the letters, the forms, the quiet sightings, he still hadn't put it together. Or maybe he had, and this was his way of pretending not to. A denial wrapped in legalese. Either way, it cut deep. Not because he challenged me, but because he erased me. Again, erased the work I'd done, the name I signed, the effort I poured into something that finally belonged to me. Like I was a ghost, even here, in a building I owned. I walked up to the 3rd floor. Slow, measured steps. I didn't knock on his door. I didn't need to see his face. I just stood outside apartment 3B, my eyes tracing the number like it might change if I looked long enough. This was the apartment I'd helped him move into. Months ago, when he said he was downsizing, said he'd be fine for now. Back when I still brought groceries, left muffins outside his door, kept trying. I remembered the day I carried his dishes up those same stairs, careful not to chip the corners. He never offered to help. Said he was on a call. I remembered the thankless silence when I dropped off blankets and hand towels, trying to make the place feel like home for him. And now he lived here unaware or unwilling to admit, whose name paid the taxes, whose hands scrubbed the walls, whose signature raised the rent. I leaned against the hallway wall for a long time. Not crying, just letting it sink in. This was the moment I realized. Not when he sold my house. Not when he put me in a basement. Not when he snapped the key and left it on the mat. It was now, this letter. This refusal to acknowledge me. To acknowledge that I was capable. Present. Worth the truth. This was the betrayal that stripped the last illusion away. Not just that he didn't want me, but that he no longer saw me. Not as his mother. Not as a person. Just a burden who had somehow returned in a different shape. Maybe it was easier for him to think the owner was a stranger. Easier than admitting his mother had found a way to stand again. To rise. To build something without his help. Maybe it threatened him. Or maybe he simply didn't care. That night, I sat in my office, the letter on the desk, a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. I didn't call him. I didn't respond. I pulled out the tenant file for Unit 3B and added a note. Responded to increase with formal objection. Pending review. Owner aware. I closed the folder slowly. Then I reached for my tea. It was cold by now, but I drank it anyway. Because sometimes bitterness reminds you that you're still alive. The next morning, I filed his letter with the others. In the same drawer where I kept property receipts, pest control contracts, and plumbing invoices. It didn't get a special place. It didn't deserve one. He would receive a response, professionally written, clear in tone. I would explain again the reasons for the rent increase, offer him a list of comparable rates in the area, give him the courtesy of facts. But I wouldn't explain who I was. Not in that reply. Let him wonder. Let the truth arrive slowly, like winter frost creeping over windows, unavoidable, silent, firm. He had taken everything from me once. But this time, I had something he couldn't take back. I had ground beneath my feet, a roof under my name, a future of my choosing. He didn't have to see me for it to be real. I was done asking for recognition. From now on, I would live in the knowing. Quiet, steady, unshakable. I stopped knocking, stopped sending muffins, stopped checking the mailbox for something from him, a card, a note, even a scrawl of acknowledgement. There was a peace in the decision, though it arrived slowly, like evening light stretching across an empty kitchen. I no longer hovered near 3B when I cleaned the halls. I no longer paused when I heard footsteps above me. The ache that once stirred in my chest at the sound of his door opening began to fade. Dull at first, then absent, like an old bruise finally letting go. Instead, I poured myself into the work. Early mornings were for checklists, maintenance calls, vendor meetings, receipts filed into neat rows. Afternoons brought small tasks, replacing knobs, scrubbing baseboards, patching drywall. It was the kind of labor most people paid others to do. But I needed it. The rhythm. The quiet. One Saturday, I spent 6 hours resealing the windows in Unit 2D. My knees groaned, my hands blistered, but I felt stronger than I had in months. Not because anyone noticed, but because I did. A woman in the mirror, no longer hunched by grief. No longer asking for permission to matter. I started dressing differently, nothing loud but firmer somehow. Sweaters with a little structure. Hair pinned back the way Harold used to like. When I walked through the halls, tenants smiled and said good morning, like I belonged there. And I did, because I had chosen this life. Even if no one else had chosen me. There was a particular joy in small victories. A door that no longer stuck. A hallway that smelled of lemon polish instead of mildew. The soft hum of a working radiator. Sometimes I'd sit in the lobby in the early evening with a book and a cup of tea, and listen to the muffled sounds of tenants cooking dinner, children laughing, water running upstairs. It felt like being part of a house again. A house that I built. And not one of them knew that the quiet old woman who fixed the mailbox locks and wiped down the banister owned the walls around them. They just knew it felt a little more like home. I'd thought once that I needed Matthew's approval to feel whole again. That his apology would fill the hollow he left behind. But slowly, without anger, without even trying, I let go of that need. He had his own version of the story. One where I faded quietly, where he did the best he could, where people like me understood, without ever being told. But I wasn't interested in that story anymore. I had a new one, written in ink and ownership papers, signed with my full name. I didn't stop being kind. That's never been my way. But I stopped softening myself to be digestible. I stopped giving the parts of me that no one asked for, just to be allowed near the table. There was a man, a plumber, who came by one afternoon to fix a leak under the stairs. He was middle-aged, wore a cap that said Lyle's Plumbing, and he hummed gospel songs under his breath while he worked. At the end, he looked at me and said, "You're doing something good here." It was the simplest thing, but it settled deep inside me like warmth. No one had said that to me in years. Not "you're useful" or "you're helpful," but "you're doing something good." That night, I left my window open and fell asleep to the sound of rain hitting the roof, a roof I had sealed. A roof that covered people who didn't even know my story. And that was the point, wasn't it? They didn't need to know my pain. Only my presence. My steadiness. My quiet return. Matthew sent one more notice, typed more forceful this time, quoting tenant rights and legal jargon. I filed it like the rest. But I didn't read past the first line. It was never about money. It was about visibility. He wanted to force the world to fit the version he believed in, where his mother had disappeared, where the building was faceless, where his decisions had no consequences. But some truths don't yell. They arrive without ceremony, like an envelope in a mailbox, or a woman in a hallway, keys jangling softly at her hip. One day, I saw him at the base of the stairs, arguing with another tenant about parking. He turned, saw me, paused. We stood there, two people who shared blood but not home. He opened his mouth. I raised one hand, not to wave, not to warn, just to signal stillness. He closed his mouth, and I walked past. That was the shift. Not in him. In me. I no longer hoped for repair. I no longer feared the silence. I had built something whole, brick by brick, with my own two hands. And that was enough. It was early spring when I found the letter. I'd been sorting through the last of Harold's old things. Boxes I'd moved with me more times than I could count but never truly opened. They lived in the far corner of my little office now, tucked neatly beneath a folding table covered with building permits and tenant files. The box was marked in Harold's handwriting, crooked in all caps. Keep private. I opened it gently, as though touching it too fast might wake some old ghost. Inside were small, ordinary things. A navy blue tie I'd once given him for Father's Day, his lucky keychain from college, a cracked wristwatch that hadn't ticked in years. And beneath it all, an envelope. Yellowed, unsealed, resting alone. It was addressed to me. I sat down slowly, fingers trembling just slightly. The letter wasn't long. He'd written it the year before he passed, tucked it away without telling me. In his neat, blocky print, he wrote, Ellie, if you're reading this, I'm not beside you anymore. And I hate that. But I know you. You'll keep going, even when it hurts. I just want you to remember, you were never meant to shrink to fit. You were always bigger than they let you be. Keep something for yourself, always. Your hand's built more than anyone will see. But I see it, and I'm proud of you. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. For so long, I'd carried the weight of wondering if Harold would be proud of how I had survived. Now I had the answer. Not loud, not showy, but sure. His voice came back to me then, like wind through a cracked window. How he used to say, even roots in darkness know where to grow. And that's when I knew. I hadn't been surviving. I'd been growing, rooting myself in quiet soil, stretching up, bit by bit, into something stronger. The letter became my anchor. Every time I doubted, I returned to it. Slid it from the drawer, read the words slowly like prayer. Not long after, I met Mr. Alvarez. He was the new tenant in 1C. Mid-60s, retired civil engineer, moved in after a long stint caring for his brother. Wore thick glasses and always carried a thermos that smelled like cinnamon tea. He knocked on the office door one morning while I was sorting mail. Hope I'm not interrupting, he said softly. Just noticed your lease template. It could use a legal eye. Mind if I offer a few suggestions? I blinked, then smiled. Suggestions are welcome, I said. I've been learning as I go. He chuckled. Aren't we all? What started as a single conversation grew quietly into something more. He showed me how to structure contracts better, how to track building expenses on a spreadsheet, even how to request small city grants for repairs. But he never tried to take over. He asked questions gently, offered help without assumption, and listened more than he spoke. One day, while reviewing maintenance bids, he paused and looked at me. You know, he said, you're a rare kind of strong. I didn't answer right away. Just folded the bid and placed it in the file. Because I wasn't used to being seen that way. But it settled in me like warmth. Not the kind that makes you glow. The kind that makes you stand taller. We began having tea every other Saturday. Nothing more than neighbors. Companions in stillness. He never asked about my family. I think he understood there were stories better left waiting. But one afternoon, as we watched the rain from the window, I told him everything. Not in one breath. Not in a rush. In slow pieces. Like stones being placed on a riverbank. He didn't flinch. Didn't try to fix anything. He just sat with it. With me. And when I finished, he nodded. Sometimes the people closest to us forget we're made of iron, he said softly. I sipped my tea, and for the first time didn't feel hollow. I felt held, not by someone fixing me, but by someone recognizing what I had already rebuilt. Later that evening, I opened Harold's letter again. And this time I added a page of my own, tucked behind his. My handwriting slower now but firm. You were right, Harold. I am bigger than they let me be. And this place, this roof, this key in my pocket, I kept it for myself. Like you said, I didn't fade. I found myself, brick by brick, in silence, in strength. And I'm proud of me too. The letter must have reached him by Monday. I knew the way the mail moved in this building, the rhythm of it. Like breath, slow and reliable. It was a copy of the finalized lease update, stapled to a clear breakdown of repairs and fee adjustments, plus a receipt for past due rent. Neatly typed. No emotion. Just facts. By Tuesday morning, I noticed his name wasn't on the mail slot anymore. And by Wednesday, his car was gone from its usual space. No knock at my office door. No note. No call. Just absence. I should have felt victorious. Or justified. But what I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after a hard frost. No celebration. No fire. Just air cleared of illusion. Mrs. Ibarra mentioned seeing him moving boxes late at night, keeping to himself, not saying goodbye. She thought he looked tired. I nodded once, then changed the subject. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I had already let him go. Weeks passed. The season tipped toward summer. The flower pots out front bloomed brighter, bolder. I added marigolds. Their color made the building feel less forgotten. Tenants began to ask about updates to the laundry room, about a bench for the garden patch. Little things, but hopeful. That's what I had become, without realizing it. A source of quiet hope. One morning, I stood by the front door and looked out at the street where Matthew used to park. It was empty now, except for a scattering of petals from the pear tree that leaned over the sidewalk. That was when I saw it. An envelope, plain white, slid under the office door. No name on the front, just folded neatly. Inside was a short note and signed. I didn't know it was you. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I was afraid. You always stood stronger than I ever understood. I'm sorry. That was all. No name. But I knew the writing. He'd once written his 4th grade book report in the same crooked print. I had helped him spell magnificent that night at the kitchen table. I held the letter for a long while, not to read it again, just to feel its weight. And then I placed it in a small box on my shelf, next to Harold's letter. Not because I forgave, not because it changed things, but because it was real. It was the first true thing Matthew had said in years. And I didn't need to reply. He had already heard my answer. In the rent notice, in the upkeep, in the brass plaque I had placed beside the front door just a week earlier. Managed and owned by E.J. Whitaker. The tenants noticed it the next day. One of them asked if I was related to the owner. I smiled and said, "That's me." They looked surprised, then nodded slowly. Well, it's in good hands. Yes. Yes, it was. The phone rang more often now, not with apologies or family guilt, but with purpose. Local groups wanting to host community events, city programs asking about senior housing availability. I said yes more than I said no. I said yes to things that grew. Things that built. One Saturday, the granddaughter of a tenant knocked on the office door, holding a drawing she'd made. A sketch of the building with sunshine pouring from the windows and flowers out front. She'd labeled it, Home. I hung it on the wall, right above the deed. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, I realized Matthew would carry the weight of what he did. Or he wouldn't. That choice was his. But I no longer carried him. I didn't wait for holidays or birthdays. Didn't set extra places. Didn't check the mailbox twice. I had once believed motherhood meant always staying open, always waiting at the gate with a light on. But now I knew better. It meant knowing when to step back inside, lock the door gently, and place the light in your own room instead. It meant not disappearing into someone else's silence. It meant choosing peace over proximity. And I had. In a building with rusted pipes and creaky floors and a garden that bloomed brighter each day, I had found something I hadn't known I was missing. Myself. Not the version shaped by motherhood. Not the outline drawn by grief. Just me. Still here. Still whole. And finally seen. It was nearly dusk when he returned. I was sitting on the bench outside the building, sipping the last of my tea, watching the soft gold of evening stretch across the street. The marigolds had opened wider that day, as if hungry for light. I didn't hear his car at first. But then footsteps. Familiar, slow, heavy. I didn't turn right away. I waited. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The same jacket he'd worn the day he told me I was dead weight. It looked smaller on him now. Or maybe he looked smaller in it. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Quiet. Careful." I looked up, held his eyes, nodded once. He didn't move closer. Just stood there, looking up at me like he wasn't sure if he should ask to sit. I gestured to the space beside me. Not an invitation. Just emotion. He took it. We sat in silence for a while. The streetlights flickered on, catching the edges of our shadows and stretching them long. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't know it was you." "Not at first." I said nothing. "I thought maybe. I thought you were gone. That you found somewhere else." Still, I stayed quiet. Because what was there to say to that? He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and tired. When I realized, I didn't know what to do. I let the quiet hold us. Let the weight of truth sit in the spaces between our words. Then I said gently, "You did what you always do." He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," I said. He looked at me then, searching my face for something. Anger, softness, invitation. But I gave him none of those. Just truth. Calm, steady, unshaken. "You made a choice, Matthew," I said. "Long before the rent. Before the key. Before the basement." His lips parted. No words came. "You chose distance. Silence. Dismissal. And when I lost what little I had left, you handed me a list instead of your hand." He closed his eyes. I let the words hang there. Not sharp. Not cruel. Just true. You may not have meant harm. But harm came anyway. He opened his eyes. "What now?" I didn't know how to help. "You didn't have to fix me," I said. "You only had to see me." He exhaled slowly, as if something inside him cracked under the weight of that sentence. "I don't know how to fix it." "I'm not asking you to," I said. He looked at me, and I saw it, regret. Not the loud kind. Not the performative kind. The quiet one. The real one. And I realized then, I wasn't waiting for his apology. I wasn't hoping he'd come back. This wasn't about fixing what broke. It was about drawing the line where it had fractured. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "But I won't go back. Not to how things were. Not to the basement. Not to being unseen." He nodded slowly. "I understand." I believed him. That was enough. Not for reconciliation, but for closure. He stood to leave. Paused. "Is there anything you need?" I looked up at him. The son I raised. The man who forgot. And then I answered, calm as dusk itself. "No, Matthew. I have everything I need." He swallowed hard. Then turned. Walked down the steps. I watched him go, not with longing. Not with sadness. But with a quiet, settled peace. Because I had said what needed to be said. Without raised voices. Without blame. Only boundaries. Only truth. And in that moment, I felt whole in a way I hadn't in years. Not because he came back, but because I no longer needed him to. The air turned warmer by the week. Windows in the building stayed open longer, letting in the soft chatter of birds and the clinking sounds of tenants preparing dinner. The old pipes groaned less. The hallways felt brighter. I added curtains to the lobby, light cotton ones that fluttered when the breeze found its way in. The building no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like a place to begin. I moved out of the office and into one of the first-floor units that became available. I kept it simple, just a small bed, a writing desk, and Harold's old armchair tucked near the window. From there, I could see the marigolds blooming and the bench where I'd spoken to Matthew that final time. The silence that followed his visit was not cold. It was restful. I never heard from him again, not in words. No letter. No call. But I didn't expect one. And I didn't want one. I had made my peace, and that peace didn't rely on him anymore. I focused on the building. Mrs. Ibarra and I organized a spring cleanup, sweeping the sidewalk, repainting the front steps, pulling weeds from the cracks in the pavement. Even the children helped. They laughed as they watered the plants and dropped sunflower seeds into fresh soil. We painted a small wooden sign and placed it in the garden. It said, "Grown with quiet hands." Someone taped a thank you card to my door afterward. No name, just a drawing of a little flower in a teacup and the words, "This place feels like someone cares." I taped it above my desk. One morning, I received a letter from the city, approval for a small grant I had applied for, meant to update old heating systems in low-income housing. I smiled as I read it. folded it into my file, marked the calendar with installation dates. Progress, not perfection. That was enough. I began keeping a journal. Not for memories. Not for what had been lost. But for what I was still building. A log of each step forward. Each little win. New tenant moved into 2B. Young teacher, quiet kind. Installed new lights in basement. Tenants smiled more in the laundry room. Read Harold's letter again. Still makes my chest warm. Every entry was a reminder. I was not fading. I was present. And thriving. Some afternoons, I sat on the bench beneath the pear tree out front, a book in my lap, my eyes half closed. Children passed on bikes. Mr. Alvarez waved from his window, thermos in hand. The world moved slowly and sweetly. And I, for the first time in a very long time, was not afraid of being alone. I was not trying to earn space. I had claimed it. One afternoon, little Ellie, my granddaughter, appeared in the garden with her mother. They stood on the sidewalk, uncertain, until I looked up and met her eyes. She was taller now, older, but her eyes hadn't changed. Neither had mine. She ran to me. No words. Just arms around my waist, her cheek against my chest. I held her close. Not tightly. Not like I was afraid she'd vanish. Just fully. When she pulled back, she looked up at me and said, "Mom said you're building something." I smiled. "I suppose I am. Can I see it?" I nodded and led her inside. Showed her the new mailboxes, the painted stairs, the flower pots, the drawing taped to my wall. She listened quietly, her fingers tracing the windowsills, her eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in years. Curiosity, maybe even pride. That night, after they left, I lit a candle in my room and placed it on the windowsill. Just one small light. Not waiting for anyone. Just honoring what had grown here. I wasn't a mother living in someone's basement anymore. I wasn't a burden shuffled between rooms. I was Eleanor Jean Whitaker. Caretaker. Builder. Woman of her own name. And as dusk fell, the building stood behind me, whole, humming, filled with lives stitched quietly into its walls. This was not revenge. This was restoration. I still wake early, before the rest of the building stirs. I sit by the window with my tea, watching the world stretch itself awake. There's comfort in routine, soft, steady, certain. Some days I walk the halls just to listen to the life echoing through them. A baby crying faintly upstairs, someone humming while frying eggs, laughter from the courtyard. They don't know the story of these walls. Not all of it. But I do. I know what was taken here, and what was rebuilt. I once believed I had to be small to be loved, to be useful, to be allowed to stay. Now I know better. You don't have to disappear to belong. You don't have to be silent to be worthy. And you don't need their permission to reclaim your space in the world. I don't know if Matthew thinks of me. I don't carry that question anymore. What I carry now is peace. The kind that comes not from forgiveness or forgetting, but from standing quietly in your own truth. From knowing you're still here, whole, grounded, and enough. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, remember this. Your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. You are not too late. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. You are a story still being written. And one day, someone might look at what you've built and say, "This feels like someone cared." Because you did. Because you do. Because you are. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments.